Hello, my name is Susan Robbins, and the class is Comparative Human Behavior class. Class, say hello to the future viewers. Hello. Okay. Yes, hello, future viewers. I like that. Okay, today we're going to be talking about social stratification. You've got some content on this in the textbook that you're reading. What I'm going to do, though, is take a look at what stratification is and then try to apply various theories that we've been working with, particularly systems theory and conflict theory, to stratification. So let's start from the PowerPoint. We're going to be looking at stratification theory. First of all, let me ask you, what is stratification? When we talk about stratification, what is it? Think back to baby sociology 101, folks. Any sociology majors in here? None, okay. Well, think about a rock and strata. You follow me? Rocks and strata. Stratification, very simply, says, back to the PowerPoint now, in every society, we've been talking a lot about inequality, right? Somebody's late. And your name is coming in? Andrea. Andrea, I would like you to sit over in the seat on the left, please. Okay, in every society, from time immemorial, there has been some form of stratification. Last week, we talked about class stratification, right? Do you remember? We're going to go back to some of those theories. But people who have taken a look at inequality through history have said that in every society, to the PowerPoint, there is inequality in the distribution of at least these three things: of power, of property, and prestige. So think about it as the three Ps, property, power, and prestige. Some of the central ideas of stratification theory are that in every society, no matter what the society is, every society is stratified into some kind of hierarchy or a ranking of groups of people. Not necessarily individuals, although everybody's cell phone's off, although individuals certainly fall within those groups, but they're looking at how groups are stratified differently. Very importantly, where you are in the stratification system, your position has an impact on every aspect of your life and of your death. Let me just give you some examples. Where you are in a stratification system affects your chance of surviving birth. I really want you to think about these things as we're talking about them. Stratification pretty much predicts how much schooling you're going to get. It impacts, this is good, your chances of getting into trouble with the law. And if you are in trouble with the law, guess what? Your chance of getting out of trouble with the law. Can you think of examples of that? Yeah, Marina.
Yeah, it reminds me of someone that I know who, I would say his upbringing affected why he gets into the law, but also his parents' economical status affects that he can get out of the law quite easily.
Okay, Anna, did you have an example?
Some of the Enron people?
I'm sorry? You have to...
Yeah. Some of the Enron people?
Yeah, people who have committed different kinds of crimes, upper class, having to do with greed. If you would sit over here, please. They have the resources to get out of trouble. Okay, other things. I really want you to think about this, because we rarely give thought to this. Your taste in art, your taste in music, even your taste in candy. Your taste in perfume. I've got a personal story to tell you about that. When I was working on the Seminole Indian Reservation, I remember one day Jennifer, who was one of the kids that I was working with, it was my birthday. I was there over the summer. It was my birthday in August. And she came to me because she was so excited. She had saved up all of her money to buy me what she thought was a really good gift. And it was perfume that you buy in the corner pharmacy. Not perfume that I would ever have worn. And yet to her, That was just about the best and most. I cherish that. I still have the bottle. I wore it once, but I still have the bottle because it was the thought that really counted. But going back, one's taste and perfume. Do we ever think about that having to do with stratification? One's taste in candy. Back to this PowerPoint. One's child-rearing behavior. The way in which you raise your children is strongly related to stratification. Your likelihood of being obese, and many other things. Okay, very importantly, stratification. I talked about the 3 Ps: power, property, prestige. Those are the general factors that we're looking at. However, stratification can be based on not only property or political power, though those are 2 of the Ps. Sometimes we stratify in society based on religion. Can you think of examples of that? Are certain religions held in higher esteem? Yeah, Anna.
Like, I know the Episcopal community is usually like the upper class level.
Okay, so some religions are just seen as being better than other religions. It depends on where you are and what country you're in and what cultures. But certainly we decide that some religions are okay and others are not. And we stratify people according to their religion. Race and ethnicity, that's a big one. I don't know why we still use the word race, because I don't know if you're aware, there is no such thing as separate races. There is no such thing as separate races. Biologically, we are more similar to each other than different. What we're really talking about is skin color. And the differences that we perceive that we call race really have more to do with ethnicity. Language. Really good example. In the U.S., we want people to speak what? Everybody with your hands down? English only, right? And what do we do to people who don't speak English? How do we treat them? As second-class citizens, right? And we insist that they speak our language. Prestige, we talked about. Gender. We are very stratified by gender. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about income distribution. We're also stratified based on sexual orientation. Also gender identification, not just gender, but gender identification. We stratify now, this is something that is relatively new in the history of society, that we're stratified based on age. And what is the ideal that we look up to in terms of age? Yeah.
Youth.
Yeah, youth, absolutely. And therefore, anybody who is not a youth, and we hit our prime when we are in our 20s, maybe 30s, and after that, it's downhill all the way in terms of stratification. These are just some of many different ways that we stratify. Very importantly, in contemporary society, we are stratified not only along those lines, but also the main issue for stratification in contemporary society is typically social class. When we think about how people differ from one another, not just biologically, but how they differ from one another, we're generally talking about social class differences, which didn't exist in ancient history in the way that they do now. And part of the reason for that is that industrialization gives rise to a social class system. Prior to that, think about this for a second. Prior to industrialization, there was not a whole lot of surplus to go around. We've always had stratification, but it wasn't based on what we now call the class system, which is why when Marx was writing in his period of time, he was conceptualizing society as being essentially different than it ever had been before because of the rise of now industry that made way for us to have surplus. Again, the machinery of industry made rise for us to have surplus. And because major and technology play a major role in the creation of wealth. Again, machinery and technology play a major role in the creation of wealth, and therefore it gives rise to what we now know as social classes. Again, there have always been different groups, but they weren't conceived of as social classes. When we talk about your position in a class system, what we're talking about is classes or groups or categories of people who receive or control different amounts of that wealth that is generated and unequal amounts. So it's not just that it's different, it's also that it's inherently unequal. Okay, back to theory. We talked last week about Marx. Does anybody remember what his two classes were? You have to, yeah.
The bourgeoisie and the proletariat.
Okay, he talked about essentially us having two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And if you remember what he said that the wealthy control two things, the means of production as well as the dominant ideologies. So Marx's first theories about social class were based strictly on economics. Strictly on economics. And in fact, what he said is that the economic monopoly by the wealthy, I hope you remember this from last week because I'm repeating something I said last week. I just want you to see how this fits into stratification theory because he was one of the first stratification theorists. He says that based on economics and economics alone, that monopoly transforms economic power into political power. He did not see them as being separate bases. Again, economic power transforms into political power. And what he said is that political institutions then serve the wealthy. Okay, in contrast, German sociologist Max Weber. Does anybody remember any of this from Intro to Sociology? Sound sort of familiar? Okay. I really want to go over this concept, and we're going to then apply, we're going to take a look at income distribution, we're going to take a look at a lot of factors and how we measure social class, because that's really important as well. What Max Weber said is that, first of all, he was inspired by Marx. His writings were inspired by Marx, but he said Marx got it wrong. Marx got it wrong. He placed too much emphasis on property. Way too much emphasis on property. And what in Weber's formulation, he said, in addition to people owning property, there are two other bases for, specifically, stratification, and that is power, which can be separate, and prestige, which also can be separate. Again, separate aspects of stratification, the three Ps. What are they? Property, everybody, use your mics. Property, power, and prestige. Okay. What he says is that there are different bases for these hierarchies. In other words, property differences generate social classes. This is Weberian thinking. He said, however, you can also have people who do not have property that have power differences based on their political groups. Differences in power lead to different political affiliations. And finally, he said, another basis of stratification is prestige. There are some people who are very prestigious, but do not necessarily have property, and do not necessarily have power. Again, property, power, and prestige, he said that these are separate bases. And you can have one and not the other. Now, what would Marx have said about that? In Marx's formulation, what was it?
You had
the haves and the have-nots.
In Marx's formulation, what was it, folks?
Have them both.
Okay, what Marx said, no, that's not correct. What Marx said is that if you had property, you will then have power, and then you will then have prestige. Do you see the difference? He's saying that there are three separate bases, that they are not necessarily overlapping. However, although they do not necessarily overlap, they often do. Let's think of some examples. Can you think of people who might have power that may not have a whole lot of property or money? It's kind of hard today because they tend to meld together.
Let me hear me. Hello. Hello.
Just hang on, please.
Oh, sorry.
Nothing? Yeah. Tiffany.
The Pope.
Okay. I think it's better to think of the Pope in terms of prestige. Think about that. Do popes necessarily... yeah, he has a lot of power, too. So here we have two overlapping. That's probably a good example. Here is somebody, a pope, who has power, who also has extremely high prestige, but not necessarily a whole lot of property. Can you think of other examples of either prestige or property or power without property? Anna?
What about a very intelligent professor who has discovered or researched in something, but he doesn't have too much money or he doesn't own anything, but he has the prestige, academic prestige?
Okay, and in fact, I think you could point to the difference in prestige between, for example, college professors. Now, some of them who are scientists and invent things and hold patents on them might or might not also have a significant amount of property that is generated from their patents. But if they discover it while they're at the university, it's university property. But they might be more highly paid. So there's an overlap. You know, when I think about prestige differences, I think, for example, of classical musicians who play for the symphony. Very high prestige, right? Higher prestige than someone who collects garbage, yes? And yet they do not necessarily make a whole lot of money, nor do they necessarily have a whole lot of power. So we can come up with examples from different occupations and different people as to who might have one and not the other. However, despite this formulation, what tends to happen is that when people are high on one of these measures, they tend to be high on the others. When they rank high on one, you tend to see them rank it, even though they can be separate. In reality, today, when they rank high on one, they tend to rank high on one of the others, if not both. Okay. Another central idea of Max Weber's was the idea of life chances. Life chances. What he meant by that, and we'll go through this carefully, life chances have to do with the opportunities, and that's why I have those words highlighted, the opportunities that any individual has to improve his or her quality of life. Now let's look at those two things separately. What he meant by opportunity was the extent to which people have access to some basic resources. Basic resources such as food, such as clothing, shelter, education, health care. Again, opportunity to him is the extent to which people in any group have the access to these very necessary things. Do we have equal access to this in society, folks? Who has the ability to have access? Who has the ability to have access?
The people with money.
Leah?
The people with money.
Yeah, the people with money, or the people with money, the people with either prestige or power. When he talks about the quality of life, there he's talking about not the necessities that we have to have, but quality of life is a person's ability to procure goods, to have a career as opposed to a job. What's the difference between the two? Think about this. What's the difference between having a job and having a career? Which gives, yeah, Marina.
One earns a wage,
Yep.
basically, and is just a daily task versus a career is something that you build upon.
Absolutely. So the ability to have a career, the ability to obtain inner satisfaction, that has to do with quality of life. The ability to not only get basic needs met, but to satisfy one's other needs as well. That's what he called the quality of life. So again, if we go back, life chances have to do with the opportunities people have, each individual has to improve his or her quality of life. So who do you think has these opportunities to do that? The wealthy, the poor, or the middle class? How much opportunity do you think the poor have? Hey, wait a minute. Isn't this the country of unlimited opportunity? Oh, you look skeptical. No? It's not? Let's take a look at what we know about life chances. I hate to have small numbers on a chart, but that's the only way I could fit this into the PowerPoint. You all can read it okay? Yes. Okay. This is taken from a variety of data sources, some of which is the most recent U.S. Census, some of which are other sources, and I've given you the citation there. What they've done in this chart is they've taken a look at the people in the lowest social class, the middle, and then the highest. And some of these are based on just demographic data, and some of these are based on questionnaires, these answers. Take a look at this disparity. People who say that they're in excellent general health, 91% of the highest social classes, and only 56% of the lowest. Being a victim of violent crime, the other direction, right? You're more likely to be the victim of violent crime if you are a lower class. Much less likely when you're higher class. The likelihood you're going to own your own home. 88% of the people in the highest class own their own home. In contrast, only 35% of the people in the lower class, the lowest class. Very important today. Obviously, you couldn't measure this, or you didn't even conceive of this during Marx's time or Weber's time. I mean, Weber was not thinking about internet access, right? Didn't exist. Didn't exist for most of my life either. But today, access to technology is another way of stratifying people, isn't it? When we talk about the haves and have-nots, the access to technology is very, very important. Children with internet access, 93% of the highest social class have it, and only 34% of the lowest. The likelihood that you're going to have children 18 to 24, either in college or having graduated from college, look at that disparity. 72% of the highest class and only 30% of the lowest class. People who say that they find life exciting, doesn't that go to quality of life? Not just basic needs? Exciting as opposed to dull or as opposed to routine. Let's go back. Who was it that talked about jobs as opposed to career? Yeah. When you have a career, you can make more of your life. You don't have a life that is dull or boring or routine. Does that make sense? This is interesting. People who see that there are opportunities to get ahead. The disparity is not that great, but this has to do with perception rather than reality, right? So what this tells us is that certainly more people who are wealthy see that they have opportunities, but surprisingly, 66% of the people who do not have opportunities perceive that they do. And happiness, which is a difficult thing to measure, 43% of the highest class say that they're very happy compared to almost just about half of that of the lowest class. So are you getting a sense about what we mean by life chances? And this is relatively recent data. Okay, let's take a look at different measures of social class, and I'm going to talk about three kinds of measures. The first one are going to be objective measures. The second is going to be subjective, and the third is going to be reputational. There are lots of different ways to measure social class. Lots of different ways to measure social class. The most common measures that are used are some combinations of occupation, what it is that you do for a living. What it is that you do for a living. Education, the educational level that you've attained. Income, by that we're talking about how much income you have annually, as compared or contrasted with wealth, and that is your net worth. That's not what you make every year, but rather your net worth. So typically when we're measuring social class, we have combinations of 2 or 3 or 4 of those measures together to try to come up with what somebody's social class is. Really interesting. I'm going to have this on WebCT for you. I've given you 2 links. There's a fascinating page in the New York Times that gives you an interactive chart that you can chart your own social class. You tell it how much you make, what your occupation is, how much wealth you have in terms of net worth, what your income is, and it charts your social class. It tells you in what percentile you are. So you might want to play with that when the PowerPoint is up later on today. And it's a really fascinating, I've given you 2 links there. The first link is to their whole thing on income distribution and social class. And the page is called How Class Works. And it has various links, so you might want to go to that first link and then play around with the others. Okay, that's how we measure social class when it comes to what we call objective measures. And typically what happens, they work on a variety of data, one of which is census data, and they put people in quintiles, fifths. And we typically talk about the highest fifth, the lowest fifth, and the middle three-fifths. And somebody determines what the quote-unquote poverty line is. And that changes from time to time, depending on inflation. How do you think we measure social class subjectively? Okay, I'd like you all to take out a pen and paper for a minute. You don't have to turn anything into me, just take out a pen and paper. You don't have to share this with anybody either. What I want you to do is write down what social class you think you're in. What social class do you think you're in? You have it? Okay, well, give me some answers. Anybody want to brave enough? If I were to write down, I would say upper middle class. Actually, I see myself more as middle class, but as of yesterday, I now know that I'm upper middle class because I clicked on that link. Yeah, Natalie.
I wrote because I'm 29. If I was by myself, I would be in the lower. But because I'm 29, but my parents are still taking care of me, we're in the middle class.
Okay, sometimes this is hard to do with students because when you are starving students and working, you are not the social class that you, based on income alone. But remember, what are the objective measures that we use? Not just income, but what are the others? Occupation, education, and wealth. So while you might not have the income and wealth, you certainly, by occupation, are going to be raised in a class, right? And by what else?
Education.
Education. Very big one. You're sitting here in a master's level class. You are better educated than most people in society. So that's going to raise your class status. Anybody else want to volunteer what they wrote down? I saw more hands up before. Yeah, Tony.
I'm just going to say that I'm in the lower middle class, I think now, but once I graduate, I would hope to be in the middle class or upper middle class as well.
Okay, so at the moment, lower middle class, but you see yourself having some class mobility once you graduate because you will be out working as opposed to going to school. Anybody else want to volunteer? Nobody? You can wait. Okay, well, what the research says, let me ask you, do you think that this is going to be a good measure or not? Do you think that this would be an accurate measure by asking people if they should write down their social class? Yeah,
Everybody thinks they're middle class.
Is that really?
Very few people will say, yes, I'm rich, or, I mean, we might have meant to being poor, but everybody thinks they're middle class.
If you go into the poorest of poor neighborhoods, do you think they're going to say that? You can't shake your head. You got to give it verb. No.
No, the poor people, like...
So not everybody thinks they're middle class, but some people do. Certainly, people aspire to middle class status. But do you think that people would know or not know what class they're in? Pretty close, if not exact. Anybody want to take the position that no, they won't know? Anybody want to take the position that yes, they would know? I'm going to start calling on people. Christina, what do you think? Do you think that people would be accurately able to tell what social class they are?
I think they would.
Okay, why? This is important. This is very important because this really has to do with class. Remember we talked last week about class consciousness? Shh, you're disrupting the class, please. We talked about class consciousness. And what did Marx say about that? That people come to see and perceive the class they're in. So you're saying yes, they would. What are some of the reasons that they would be accurate?
Maybe the environment that they're in.
Yeah, the environment in they're in. They look around, they see other people who have similar things that they do. They take a look at who they associate with. And what the research has shown, very famous study, done in, I believe, in the 30s. Now I have to go to my notes. Some of this I do off the top of my head. Yeah, it's called the Yankee City Study, done in the 1930s. Yankee City, meaning it was done up north, not in the south, got it? Warner, sociologist, asked people what class they thought they were in, and guess what? They were pretty much accurate. They were pretty much accurate. And why do you think that is? Any ideas, Megan?
I think because class is something that's so ingrained in our society and people are treated differently on a regular basis. So I think people are reminded what their class is, whether they want to know or not.
Okay, people are reminded what their class is, whether they want to know or not, and what you're saying is accurate. It is so ingrained that we are able to see class differences between ourselves and between others. Now, if we don't know our neighbors very well, then it's hard to tell, but just based on residentially where we live, the kinds of restaurants we go to, we'll go back to this, the kinds of perfume we wear, the kind of candy you tend to like. Not only do we know what upper class and middle class and lower class is, but so does everybody else. So therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that people actually have a very good sense of what their class is. People actually have a very good sense of what their class is. So the subjective measure is you ask people what class they're in, and then you try to determine, based on objective measures, how close they are. And what we have found is that people are pretty close, because we have a very strong class consciousness. Again, we see ourselves, we see our neighbors, and we see groups that tend to fit together in terms of similar tastes, similar lifestyles, similar residential facilities, similar, if not identical, occupations. When people live in a middle-class neighborhood, they know it. When they live in a working-class neighborhood, they know it. When they live in River Oaks, trust me, they know it. And if you live in the 3rd Ward, 4th Ward, you also know that too. And you look around and the subjective measures are pretty accurate. Another way that we measure social class is a reputational measure. Reputational measures. People, and in that we ask people to identify other people's social class based on knowledge of that person's circumstances. Now this only works in relatively small communities. Why would that be? Why would a reputational measure not necessarily work in Houston? Tiffany, any ideas?
Well, there are a lot of people in Houston, so...
You have to raise your voice.
There are a lot of people in Houston.
Okay, there are a lot of people in Houston. I mean, we're talking about a big metropolitan area, right? Big metropolitan area, and we don't necessarily know our neighbors. How many of you know everybody who lives around you? Can I see raise of hands? How many of you know many of the people who live around you? How many of you don't really know your neighbors? Okay, and if I were to ask you, most of you, to tell me what social class your neighbors were in, would you be able to do it? Those of you who said you don't know your neighbors, would you be able to do it?
Yes.
Based on what?
Just based on my own class, and I know that if I can live in a house in the neighborhood that they're living in a house in, then I can assume that we make about the same amount of money, or we have the same resources available to us.
Okay, and that guess might be correct, and it might be incorrect. You're probably better off at telling your own social class, but we have a sense of people who live in specific areas, whether we're correct or not, live in similar circumstances as we do. Yeah, Lavina.
Well, I was just going to say that that's not necessarily true. I mean, people live in neighborhoods for different reasons. I've lived in the same small house to save money for a while, so... so it doesn't matter, it doesn't mean you're in the same class as the people that are in your neighborhood.
Okay, it doesn't mean that you are, and if your neighbors don't know you well enough to know that, they would have no way of really knowing. That's why typically reputational measures if we have spit that out, that's a hard one, tight-knit neighborhoods, then probably you're going to have a better sense of your neighbors and their circumstances. But in sprawling metropolitan areas, very often we don't have that. So when we don't know, we know our neighbors only to say hello to. We don't know what they do for a living. We figure if they're living here, they must have X amount of money, but we could be wrong, we could be right. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay, let's go back to the notion that Max Weber said that there are three separate bases for stratification: power, property, prestige. If we had unlimited mobility, they would not cluster together necessarily. But since they cluster together, I want you to think about how much mobility do we have? Do we have a lot of mobility? Folks, what is the American dream? You don't know? Tony, the American dream.
I think it's to get married, have a house, 2.5 kids.
And the idea that anybody can work their way up, no matter what beginnings you come from, you can work your way up the social class scale, right? Do you think we can or not? Can anybody do it? You're shaking your head. You have to tell me why not.
Well, they've done some studies that say that most people that are in the middle class, no matter how hard they work, stay in the middle class, and the poor basically stay poor, and the rich stay rich.
Okay, so that suggests that we don't have a whole lot of mobility, right?
Right.
Okay. Anybody take a different position? Yeah.
I do. I think our current president is a wonderful example of that. If you believe what he told about his upbringing, he certainly didn't have a lot of resources, and now he's our president. So.
Okay, so what you're saying is that certain individuals, whether it be the current president, a future president, or going back to history, Abe Lincoln, right, who did work his way up from meager beginnings, to say the least, we're saying that certain individuals can, in fact, we could point to them and say, he did it, she did it, why can't you do it? Yes? Well, don't we do that? Don't we do that? Yes or no?
Yes.
And when we see people who are struggling and trying and they don't make it, what do we say to them? Lorraine? You're not going to say that? Okay. So we tell them they're not trying hard enough. We say there's something wrong with them. Yes? Again, what we tend to do is that we tend to look at that one individual or the two individuals that come from meager beginnings and they work their way up and all of a sudden they're wealthy. And it's not like it never happens, whether it be somebody ascending to a presidency or somebody who has talent and becomes a major rock star, major sports figure. I mean, we could certainly point to those individuals. And that gives us what I'm going to call the illusion of mobility. Well, isn't it important for us in the United States to believe that we have mobility? What would happen if we didn't believe that? What would happen if we didn't believe that? Tony?
We would stop making money for the rich people, basically. I think.
Okay, would you explain that a little bit more? I like that.
I think as long as we continue to think that we can make more money, that we get that sort of veil of ignorance that we can be rich. So we keep working harder and harder to try and attain a goal, all the while we're just basically putting money into the 10% of people that own everything.
You sound like a Marxist. Well, isn't that what Marxist theory says? And yet, we have this illusion that we're working to better ourselves, and I certainly think that Marx would say it is illusion, and it's important, remember what Marx said, that because the wealthy control the dominant ideologies, they continue to have us believe that. They continue to have us believe that. Anybody, how much social mobility do you think we have? Is there no mobility? And I'm not just talking about the individuals who make it. Is there no mobility? Boy, that would be depressing, wouldn't it? If people really believed in this country that there was limited mobility, why would we work? Why would we strive to get ahead? Let's take a look at some social mobility data. By the way, there have been numerous studies on social mobility, and there are all different kinds of measures. And needless to say, you can always critique the data. What are the things that we want to see when we have any data set? Do we accept any one study as being the answer or not? Nobody can hear you in the audience. Shaking your head won't do it. Do we ever rely on one data set, one study?
No.
Do we ever do that? Anna?
No,
Why not?
because we need to look if it's proven or if there's enough evidence.
Okay, we need to see whether, please. We need to see whether or not there's evidence to support one study. One study proves nothing. Studies have to be replicated. Well, and you can always find problems with methodology of the study depending on who did it and what methods they use. So no study is perfect. However, there have been historical studies on social mobility, and while it changes slightly, they all pretty much come up with similar findings. So this most recent data on social mobility pretty much supports what we have known previously. First, let's talk about different kinds of mobility. Intergenerational mobility, and that's essentially what we're concerned about. Whether or not one's children can rise above the social class of one's parents. So there we take a look at not just how much you make and can you make more and rise within your lifetime, but one of the things we're really concerned about, and many of the measures that are used, look at intergenerational mobility. Again, the degree to which the economic success of children is dependent on their parents' economic status. That's what intergenerational. So therefore, if you have a higher level of intergenerational mobility, what does that mean? It means that there really is equal opportunity. Let's go back to our American dream. The American dream tells us no matter what beginnings you come from, if you try hard enough, you will succeed. And therefore, even if your parents are poor and you grew up in poverty, the onus of responsibility to achieve a higher class status lies on who? You, yes? Your own hard work, Here are some key findings. What the author found, this is really important. Children from low-income families have only 1% chance of reaching the top 5% of income. Think about that for a second. Children born into poverty have only a 1% chance of attaining the top 5% of income. Children of the rich, on the other hand, have about a 22% chance. And folks, it's not only that way this year, or last year, or the year before, but it's been that way all along. Essentially, the wealthy control the majority of the goods, of the money, of the power, and everything else, but especially when it comes to money. I'm going to throw some, by the way, you don't have to memorize these figures. No figures will ever be on a test. I want you to really just understand conceptually what these findings mean in terms of mobility. We find that children from the middle quintile, remember they measure them in fifths, the top fifth, the lower fifth, and the three middle fifths. Children from the middle quintile, and this is based on, I believe, 2005 census data, and that middle quintile is families earning, this is family data, earning $42,000 to $54,000 more or less, had about the same chance of moving up as they did of moving down. Let's think about that for a second. That's a really, really important concept. What that says, by the way, there is mobility. Not necessarily in the direction that you want. Not necessarily in the direction that you want. Again, children born into that middle quintile could just as easily move down as they move up. Let's stop and think about mobility is not always upward, is it? Let's think about this for a second. What other kinds of mobility do we have other than upward? Are we brain dead today? How about I've got to look at name tags. Terica. In addition to upward mobility, we have?
Downward mobility.
Okay, downward mobility. People can, in fact, lose money, lose status, lose power, lose prestige, right? And certainly when it comes to income, take a look at the economic mess. I'm going to be nice on what I call it. The economic mess of 2008 going into 2009. What happened to a lot of people? They're experiencing downward mobility because of what's going on in the stock market. What happens when people have job loss? They experience downward mobility, yes? Is downward mobility stressful? Yes? In what ways? Tiffany, in what ways would downward mobility be stressful?
Well, you don't have the same social status. You don't make as much money.
Okay, so you're losing not only money, but you're losing social status. And when you lose your home and then have to move to someplace else, it's very, very stressful, particularly downward mobility, because now you're among people who are, quote unquote, not like you. Yeah, Terica, you had your hand up.
I was going to say that they're not only having to, but the loss of income, being able to afford certain things, and then all of a sudden not being able to afford the kind of food they're used to eating, the type of car they're used to driving, being in a certain neighborhood.
Okay, so it affects many avenues of life other than just money, but not having money certainly affects your ability to have the things that you want and need. What about upward mobility? Is that stressful? You're shaking your head. Yeah, Natalie, in what way? When you shake your head, that means you're going to get called on. You might get called on anyway.
It can also be stressful in my point of view because then you have to, people expect more out of you. And then you probably sometimes wouldn't know how to handle that because you come from something else.
Absolutely. People now have certain expectations of you that you may or may not be able or willing to meet. How else might upward mobility be stressful? Marina?
Well, also the people that were in your social class, and if you move up into a different social class, they might not like that much or feel that they fit in with you, or you don't want to fit in with them.
Yeah, when you think about class structure, hang on. When you think about class structure, most of us have friends that are the same social class as us. So if we all of a sudden make more than they do and we start moving upward, what happens to those friendship ties? They might resent you and you might resent them because you are now looking at them slightly differently, yes? You have to adapt to a whole new sets of norms. I just really want you to see that mobility in either direction can be extremely stressful. We also have, in addition to vertical upward and downward, we also have horizontal mobility. Moving from one position to another, but not up or down. For example, I could move from, I want to give some fair examples. Somebody who was a professor at the University of Texas could go to Berkeley and consider that horizontal mobility. Berkeley to Michigan, horizontal mobility. Moving to a college that has a higher reputation is upward mobility. Now here we're dealing with professions, and moving to one that is seen as a lesser, not a research institution, lower mobility. You all following that? So when we talk about mobility, we're not only talking about upward mobility, but what do we think of when we think about mobility? We tend not to think about downward. We aspire to what, everybody? Upward mobility, right? Okay, back to the PowerPoint. So therefore, again, the key findings that people from the middle quintile can move up or down, and they're just as likely to go either way. Importantly, their chances of attaining the top 5 percentiles of the income distribution, only 1.8%. Let's go back. We said the very poor only had 1%, right? Do you remember that? 1% chance of attaining the upper 5%. Well, guess what, folks? The middle class only has a 1.8% chance of attaining that upper class status in terms of income. What that suggests then, let's think about that. What that suggests then is that this dream of upward mobility is not only blocked for the very poor, but significant upward mobility is also in terms of groups or classes of people, not individuals. Because again, we're going to point to the president, we're going to point to some superstar, we're going to point to some super athlete and say, oh, look, they made it. But we're talking about groups or classes of people. Within groups of people, the ability to attain that very upward status is extremely, extremely limited. When they looked at race ethnicity, here's what they found, that African American children born in the bottom quartile, now here we're talking about quartiles and not quintiles. Again, let me explain. It depends on the data set that you're using, and this will also use multiple different data sets. Some data sets divided by quintiles, in other words, fifths, some divided by fourths. What they found is that African American children born in the bottom quartile are nearly 2 times as likely to remain there than white children who are also born into the bottom quartile. What does that suggest to you? Alicia, what does that suggest to you? Black kids who are born into poverty are more likely to stay there than white kids that are born into poverty.
That things aren't very equal.
That, separate from groups of people, that there is something structurally going on in terms of color of skin. That things simply are not equal. That mobility exists more for white folks than for black folks, as a group, not as individuals. Okay, let's go back to PowerPoint. Another finding is that they're 4 times less likely to attain the very top quartile. When you compare blacks and whites, they are 4 times less likely to ever attain the top quartile. Again, so we're talking here about structural inequality based on the color of somebody's skin. Not on their ambition, not on their ability to succeed. Also, very importantly, what researchers do is they say, okay, we can't just look at income, we have to look at other factors. So it might just not just be structural inequality, it might be something else. So let's take a look at whether or not, for example, it has to do with characteristics of the parents, background factors such as the parents' education, the parents' occupation. They also took a look and they factored out the children's education and the children's health. They also factored out the fact that many of these black children came from female-headed households, which historically, well, think about this, folks. If you have only one parent working, and it takes 2 parents to support a family, you're going to have more poverty in general. So we have for a very long time blamed, quote unquote, female-headed households for keeping people in poverty. And we'll talk more about that. They also took a look at people who were receiving public assistance, and once they controlled for all those factors, what did they find? That these differences in mobility between blacks and whites still remained. So therefore, it has less to do with the factors associated with the people themselves and more to do with the structure of society. Does that make sense to y'all? Is that a yes? Yes. Okay. Other key findings. This is also pretty important. When you look at international standards, the U.S., in other words, we compare the United States mobility data to other countries, we have a lower rate of mobility, lower chance of mobility, intergenerationally. Does that surprise you? Isn't America the land of dreams where anybody can be anything they want? And we look at President Obama, and what do we say? He did it, why can't you? We look at Abraham Lincoln, we say, he did it, why can't you? What almost every study has found, not just this study, and remember I talked about the fact that you've got to replicate studies? What almost every study has found is that our parents' income, how much our parents earn, is very predictive, extremely predictive of our income as adults. Let me repeat that. What our parents earn, their income very strongly predicts our income as adults. Think about that for a second. By the way, this is not just this one study that found this. This is multiple studies that have found the same thing. What does that, Shakira, what does that suggest? When you think about that, if I told you that no matter what your ambition is, your parents' income is going to predict pretty much what you earn, would you believe it?
Well, for me personally, no, I wouldn't believe it.
Okay, but if you think about groups of people?
Yeah, I pretty much tend to believe it for a group of people, but not on an individual basis.
Okay, so we can't apply this group data. That's a good point. We can't apply this group data to any individual. But yet, what do we tend to do when we look at groups of people? We say, she made it. How come you didn't? Why don't you have the ambition? What do we do? Do we tend to blame people? We tend to blame people when they can't make it, rather than taking a look at the structural barriers that actually exist for people. Any questions? Okay, let's move on. We're going to take a look now at how different theorists, because remember I said we want to compare and apply different theories. Compare and apply different theories. What we're going to take a look at is how different theorists have taken a look at stratification, because stratification is both a theory and it's also a fact. What do I mean by that? Stratification is both a theory. We theorize about how stratification comes to be, right? But yet, if we take a look factually, every society is stratified. So therefore, the theories have to do with not does it exist, but how does it come to be? Do you understand that subtle difference? Stratification is a fact. Every society throughout the history of the world has been stratified in one way or another, whether it be by feudal systems, whether it be by slave systems or class systems, there's always stratification. So stratification is a fact, and when we get to the theoretical part of it, what we're asking people to do is to theorize about how did this come about. Not is it, but why is it? That make sense? Yeah? Okay, so we're going to take a look at different theories, and the three we're going to look at are how a systems theorist would look at stratification in society. And specifically, these are fairly historical, what I call classic works, but it really shows how you apply different theories to the same fact and come out with very, very different meanings. We're going to take a look at Kingsley Davis and Wilbert Moore, who give you a systems view. In other words, a system is analysis of stratification. We're going to take a look at Melvin Tooman, who comes back with a counter-argument from a conflict perspective. And then we're going to take a look at Gerhard Lenski, who has a certain kind of distributive theory, who says, wait a minute, it's not either or, it's both, and how can I synthesize them? How can I synthesize them? So let's take a look at what these theorists said. Away from the PowerPoint now? Okay. What Davis and Moore argued, this was in the 1940s, they said stratification is necessary. Stratification is necessary. He's coming from a systems perspective, structural functional perspective. And what they said, excuse me a sec. They said stratification is necessary. Every society has certain tasks that it absolutely has to accomplish. And therefore, since every society has tasks that it has to accomplish, what do we have to do? Think about this. How do we get people to give up immediate gratitude, to go to college, to give up big chunks of their life, to become doctors, to become lawyers, to become civil engineers? What do we have to do? How do we get people to do that? I mean, this is a real question about how can we persuade people that they really want to give up? And think about how long you have to study to be a doctor, to be a lawyer, to be an engineer, to be a judge. How do we get people to do that? The other thing is that not only would you have to figure out some incentive, we have to figure out an incentive, but we also have to ensure that the most qualified people are the ones who occupy the most important positions. That's what they argued. Well, think about it. How many of you would like to have an unqualified doctor operate on you? Any takers? None. How many of you want a lawyer who really is not very qualified at law? So their argument is that we have different positions in society, and the positions that are the most important are the ones that should be rewarded the most. Otherwise, we're never going to get people to give up big chunks of their life to delay their own immediate gratification and work so that they become people who are suited to these professions. Does that make sense? So what these theorists said is that the key here is individual motivation. You've got to be able to motivate people in order for society to survive. Because if we can't find some motivational system to get the most qualified people into those best jobs, then society is going to be floundering. What they argued is that the best way to do this is to use rewards. Best way to do this is to differentially reward different occupations. They said you cannot pay a garbage collector that doesn't need that much skill as much money as you pay a doctor. Otherwise, if you did, wouldn't everybody become garbage collectors? Well, if you could put up with the garbage. But think about, other jobs, other kinds of jobs. The jobs that, if you paid somebody who cleaned your house the same amount that you pay a lawyer or a judge, why would people put their life on hold if they could make money at these other jobs? And essentially what they said is that you've got to have some kind of motivational system. In other words, they said if you provide a carrot, what's going to happen is that folks who have the abilities are going to strive to reach that carrot. Now, isn't that what we've been taught? Yes? Okay. In fact, this is the foundation of the American dream. And what they argued, they said that inequality is absolutely necessary for society to survive. Now let's go back and think about this conceptually. Systems theory focuses on what? Consensus, right? What's more important, the individual or the larger structure? Lorena?
The larger structure.
Yeah, what we're looking, remember we said most systems theories are more concerned with the harmony and the balance, remember that? And they would say, okay, we've got to have different stratification, we've got to have different ranking, and you've got to reward the people with the most important jobs, the ones that require the most skill, you've got to disproportionately reward them for the good of society. It makes no difference if it's not good for the good of the person, because we want to have the most qualified people in those positions. Therefore, they argue, this goes back to functionalism, that's a functional necessity for high prestige and high income to go to the most skilled and the most important jobs. Do you have any argument against that? How does that sit with you? Anna, what are your thoughts about this?
To me, sincerely, it makes sense. Because it makes sense.
It makes sense.
Yes, because the effort and the delay gratification, as you mentioned, it has to be recognized and compensated.
Has to be recognized, has to be compensated. We've got to provide that carrot. How about you, Heather?
I was going to say pretty much the same thing. I mean, the more you work for something and the longer it takes, then I guess the payoff should be greater.
And we believe that. Isn't that part of anybody who doesn't believe that? Anybody who doesn't believe that? Okay. So what they argued is that social inequality is both positive, and not only positive, but it's functional for society. Can you understand from a system's perspective how they can argue that? They said that it's both positive for society, but not only positive, it's functional. Nobody has a problem with that theory? Yeah. Megan.
I
think there's a little bit of a logical flaw, at least related to mobility, because some of the people that have the potential to be the most qualified may not have access to the resources. Because you may have, you know, a kid that excels at science and is born to be a doctor, but if he doesn't have access to college, he's never going to be able to go to medical school, et cetera. So.
Okay, so what you're saying then is that if the opportunity is not there, you might not get the best skilled people, because somebody who has the talent might never achieve or have the ability to achieve that.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else have a problem with this theory? Okay, let's take a look. And the view that you're arguing, Megan, the view that you're arguing is a conflict view. And Melvin Tillman came back and said exactly what you said. His position was exactly the same. What he said is, what he was debating is whether or not there's really a functional necessity to attach prestige and honor to any specific occupational ranking. What Tillman says is how important a job is not an objective thing, that it depends on social norms. And I want you to think about this for a second. Can we really run a society without somebody to collect garbage? Without somebody to rake up our lawns, mow the lawns, clean our houses? Who is to argue that those jobs are any less important than the doctor, the lawyer, the university professor, or the judge, or the engineer? And yet, in our society, our norms are what? That some jobs are more important, and therefore they should be more highly rewarded, and some jobs are less. So what Tillman pointed out is that is based on norms. There's nothing inherent in any jobs that make them either more or less prestigious. And what he said, and this goes right to the heart of what you were saying, Megan, is that it is impossible to identify all talented people in society. And in fact, he pointed out that many are simply excluded, totally excluded from competing. And what you said, potential, right? Folks with potential, and he pointed specifically, take a look at women. And he was writing, I believe, in the 50s also. Women who might have the potential were back then excluded from many jobs, and guess what? Still are. Minorities of color, also excluded from many jobs. And this goes back to the basics of your circumstance that you're born into. If you're born into poverty, you are more likely to go to poorly funded schools, live in poor housing conditions, have poor nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. So he says some people are simply excluded structurally, as opposed to based on what? Their own initiative. The other thing he pointed out, and this is really interesting, that the sacrifices that people make to get those high-paying jobs are really not all that great. Well, what was the argument? You've got to, systems theory says you've got to differentially reward these because otherwise people are not going to take these jobs. Now, what Tillman pointed out is that people sometimes will study for a profession not necessarily for the money, but for their own self-satisfaction, the joy of the work. That what he was arguing is that separate from the money attached to a job, that there are intrinsic values to jobs. And sometimes just the joy of the work will get people to occupy those positions. And what he pointed out, this is Tillman, is that stratification tends to self-perpetuate. What happens is that people who are in advantageous positions, what happens to them? They continue in them. Folks, think about this. 2008, we had an economic downturn, yes? We had a banking crisis. And what are the ripple effects of that? Tiffany, what's going on, ripple effects of the banking crisis?
People are...
What's happening to jobs right now?
Oh, people are losing their jobs.
Yeah, people are losing their jobs. People are losing their jobs. The top bankers, if they lose their jobs, are they going to come out okay or not? Any ideas? The folk, who said yes? Lorena?
Yes, they're going to come out okay. They still have money.
What about the average working Joe?
Average working Joe's going to lose his house.
Big difference. Essentially, what he said is that people in the higher positions tend to perpetuate those positions. Even when there's a big economic downturn, most of them are going to bounce back. Why? They already have the skills at investing, so when the markets come back, the banks come back, the jobs come back, they're still going to be in a higher position than the average working Joe. Yeah, Anna.
In the company where my husband works, the CEO is getting a 53 million bonus, and they told all the employees that there's no raises for this year.
Very good example. The folks at the top tend to perpetuate their own circumstance. Even when they have a downturn, the people who suffer most are not the people at the highest ranks, but the people in the middle and the low ranks. The other thing, and this goes right to the heart of what you were saying, the other thing that he pointed out is that inequality of this sort creates an atmosphere of hostility. An atmosphere of hostility. So how do you think the worker who just lost his or her job feels about the executive that just got a multi-million-dollar bonus?
An uprising.
The other thing that Tuman, please do not disrupt the class. Is that clear? Okay. Society, he pointed out, gives its greatest rewards not necessarily for ability, but for conformity, for playing the game. Does that make sense to you all? You play the game, you conform, and society is going to reward you. He says, the other thing he pointed out is that some of the greatest contributions we've had have been made by nonconformists. Essentially, what he was arguing is that inequality is not necessarily functional, and it's not necessary. Let me take that back. It's not necessarily functional, and there's no specific degree of inequality that is necessary. In other words, there will always be inequality, yes or no? Whether it's based on power, property, prestige, gender, we're always going to have that around. But what he said is that the degree of inequality is not a given. You can certainly have less inequality. So what he said is that rather than talking about inequality as being something that must be, we must talk about it as something that is, not what it has to be. Does that make sense? Which theory does it sound like? It's a conflict theory. It sounds like Marx, right? Workers of the world unite, take away some of the power, take away some of the wealth, and let's make the playing field more equal. And yet when we think about that, we think about what? Creeping socialism or communism, right? And yet if we accept capitalist economy and society the way it is, and say it has to be that way, what would Tuman say? We're deluding ourselves. It doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. Does that make sense? Okay, we're going to break now. Let's talk about the dynamics in the room. Let's talk about the dynamics in the room. How are you folks over here feeling?
Mad. Oppressed.
Mad, oppressed. You have to use the...
Frustrated.
Frustrated. How are you feeling, Tony?
Ignored.
Ignored. A little bit, but not terribly. How about you?
Yeah, feeling no, but I knew what you were doing.
And?
I went along with it.
Why?
I went along with the game. That's what life is about.
Ah.
Went along with the game.
What I have just demonstrated, and I did this deliberately with this lecture, what I just demonstrated, by the way, do you have any idea how I separated you? Anybody have a clue?
Idea. Yeah, that I want to know.
Alphabetically. Ah, so folks, do not take it personally. I went right down the middle of the alphabet. There are 25 in the class, 13 are on this side, and the last part of the alphabet is here. So please do not take it personally. I want to get it. What are some of you feeling right now? Vanny. You have to press. Is that mic not working? That one's dead. Okay, what did you say? And yeah. Can I reach? Okay. What are you feeling?
I don't even talk that much in class anyways, but I was like kind of irritated. And then once
I knew you were doing that, I was just kind of like, whatever. You know, like, just deal with it.
And you know what, folks, that is easy. She says, whatever. That's easy to do because you know, you have a sense of me and you know that it's going to end today. You hope anyway. Think about kids who sit in classrooms every day of their life, and get treated like that. What I just duplicated for you is a very famous experiment called brown eyes, blue eyes experiment. Has anybody read about that in psychology? Where a teacher separated children based on the color of their eyes and ignored one half of them and really nurtured the other half. And what you're looking at are the different kinds of dynamics that evolve. And what you found is that the ignored half, again, if I were to do this time after time, how would you feel? Would you still feel as okay, you're going to go along with it? What about you, Sarah? If I did this next week and the week after and the week after?
I wouldn't feel good about myself. I would feel left out.
Would you continue to go along with it?
I wouldn't continue to go along with it.
What options do you have?
I have no choice.
Oh, what are the choices? We're going to come back over to you in a minute.
I was thinking about something, either passing a piece of paper around that we could all walk out. Just an uprising. I'm more of a rebel type. Anyway.
And think about this in real life. And what I saw going on here, and I think that we captured some of this on tape, is that you folks kind of lost interest. You folks were paying attention to them somewhat, yes? But you were focused on me. Look at verbal behavior I got out of people who usually don't talk in class. You folks were still very attentive. You were a little bit distracted by that, but you were still paying attention. How many of you here were zoning off someplace else? In the back. Neftali, Vanny. Take a look at the dynamics of exclusion and what happens when people experience discrimination. And yes, you could have walked out. And you could have had an uprising, but who would that have hurt? It would have hurt you. It would have hurt you. And don't kids do this every day in classrooms? They say, "Oh, I'm bored with this class. The teacher's not paying attention. I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to get back at her." Right? Yeah. Ashley.
After I raised my hands a couple of times, he completely ignored me. I started to feel like I wasn't a part of the conversation, and like whatever you were lecturing about, I wasn't obtaining the information anymore because I was like,
Thank you. Thank you. That's again, I want you to take a look at the dynamics of exclusion and what happens. Not only do people get mad, they get irritated. Some people say, okay, it's no big deal, and they put themselves in a little cocoon. But other people just zone out. They no longer can get the information. I'm willing to bet that all of you have very good notes, and some of you do, and a lot of you don't. How are you feeling over here, Lorena?
Being the golden children over here, I don't know how everybody else felt, but for me, I mean, after a while, I kind of wanted to stop because since you kept looking over here and calling on, after a while, I wanted to stop making eye contact, because I was feeling bad for the rotten children on the other side of the room.
Why didn't you do anything? Why did you continue to let me do this?
Well, to be quite honest, I probably would have talked to somebody after class about it, but not in front of you.
Why not? No, I really want to
because you're a person of power and prestige. So then we would talk behind your back and.
And what would that accomplish?
Well, we would unite. Basically.
Do you really think so?
Maybe not. I mean, they would get mad, probably. They would get mad, but I mean, I would try to probably find a solution to the problem, but maybe that's...
I have done this in many classes over the years, and this was truncated because usually I have a 3-hour class, and I've had to fit this into 2. And in the past, I've done this. We've taken a break and come back to the same seats, or even when people then start to mix with each other. And there has never been a full uprising. Sometimes in the past, I've had students on the ignored half throw things at me. Well, the most extreme it ever got is some students were they walked out of the room, but who does that hurt? Doesn't hurt me. Doesn't hurt you, does it? I've had people throw things at me, to which I got very strict and took them down to the dean's office. The dean, of course, was in on this. But isn't that what happens in real life? What I want all of you to think about are the dynamics that went on here. And while you're blaming me, guess what? You folks are both just as culpable. Yeah, Tony.
I was going to say I kept wanting to get on the mic and say I want to hear what they have to say, but at the same time, I didn't want to lose my position. I was afraid that you'd be like, okay, go sit with them.
Take a look at the kind of group pressure that evolves. By the way, folks, I hope you recognize the reason I can do this is that I've been on stage my whole life. Most faculty would not be able to do this with a straight face. I've been on stage my whole life, and I've been acting and playing music my whole life. So to me, when I do this, this is just a role that I'm playing. So please do not take it personally, and do not take it personally. What you're talking about is the tremendous social pressure, the tremendous social pressure that we have if we're in the haves, not to do anything to help the have-nots, because we're afraid of losing our own position. So it's not just that I am the power and authority. In your own self-interest, in all of our own self-interest, we want to stay on the favored side. And we get afraid that we're going to be kicked over to that side. What else were some of you feeling over here? Yeah.
I felt a lot of pressure. Just because you were looking at us and I knew you were going to call my name eventually. And so we had to really pay attention and be able to answer.
The pressure to pay attention, the pressure to be all that you can be, whereas they had pressure not to be anything. So yes, you were feeling pressure. Again, I did it just randomly. Had it been opposite, it might not have been as profound because I think we have more talkers, the usual talkers over on that side. But that, by the way, it could have been either way. So you were feeling pressure, and why didn't you say something? Let me ask, is there anybody here who didn't recognize what was going on at all? That is not uncommon. That is not uncommon.
I just thought that you never saw her raise her hand. Linda raised her hand so many times. And I was like, she won't turn around and look at her, but I didn't know that you were doing it on purpose.
What that brings up is another dynamic that happens. Folks, this is really important to talk about. That's another dynamic. Many times there is oppression going on and we don't see it, both on the part of the oppressors, and folks, you were the oppressors, along with me. Is there anybody on this side who wasn't really aware? Thank you. And there are people who are oppressed who are not even aware of their own oppression. What were you thinking? Yeah, Michelle.
Well, being that I've been in your class and I know your personality, I just thought you were having a bad day. Or
That's, by the way, that's a very common, what do? We rationalize. Rather than seeing our oppressed condition for what it is, we'll rationalize, oh, this is just temporary. This is just for today. I'm going to play along with the game. Or some people don't even see it, and they come up with other reasons for why it's happening. And unfortunately, what happens many times, if this were an ongoing situation, many of you would eventually come to blame yourselves. Many of you would eventually, after getting mad at me, some of you would have just come to blame yourselves and say, well, maybe I'm not measuring up in this class. Maybe she's not calling on me because my answers are wrong all the time. And take a look at the kind of self-doubt and separatism that those kind of feelings engender. Okay, how about you, Jean?
The first time you got me, and I was really shocked, and she really not.
Okay, the first time, start over.
The first time, I was raising my hand, and it was like, how weird that she can't see me, and I got really frustrated. I felt invisible. It was like...
And how did you start feeling after I cut you off again and again? What did you start feeling?
A couple of times, and then we figured it out, but before figuring out, I was hurt, I was feeling dumb and invisible, surprised. I was trying to figure it out. I was feeling bad. I was frustrated. I was wanting to leave, but I thought it's not going to do anything. I was mad at you.
But you didn't leave.
No, because I was interested in in the class, and I was taking notes, and I was dying to answer things, but I just I gave up.
Well, what you're describing, again, the reason I'm going so deep into what you were feeling, what you were experiencing, is that these are the different kind of reactions. There are some people that just zone out and phase out, and they don't learn. Others realize they're being discriminated against, and yet they will put more into it, and they're the ones who might raise their class status because they're able to say, oh, this feels crappy, this is terrible. However, I'm going to pay attention and I'm going to succeed to some extent. But given what we know about limited class mobility, that extent to which people can succeed might be very, very minor. Anna and then Lorena.
I was oblivious to what was going on, but however, I noticed that Linda, she raised her hand so many times, and at some point I even told you to look at her. I mean, I signed to look at her, but you just didn't pay attention.
No, there was no way I was going to acknowledge anybody over there other than to do what? Than to shush them? To let them know that they were being disruptive, right? Yeah.
I think for me too, I was thinking as part of the Golden Children that I was.
Oh, we have the Golden Children. I love it.
Yeah, that I would have lost over time, like faith and trust in you, like as someone that you would respect, but then also be uncertain because if you can do that to them, you can do that to me too. So I would feel I wouldn't trust you.
You might not trust me, but you would let this continue because, as Tony pointed out before, you're afraid that I'm going to do that to you. You don't want to be on the disfavored side, so therefore we keep the class system the way it is. Yeah, Tony, you had your hand. Tony had your hand up.
Well, before I figured out what was going on, I thought there was some dynamic going on between you and whoever. I wasn't sure who you kept shushing and stuff. So I thought, at first I thought, she's not looking over here because, there's something going on behind me. But then after it went on for a while, I said, okay, this is like the chip game. I know something's up here. But, that's what I thought.
He's talking about the star power game that we did in the foundational semester.
Yeah. So, I thought, that's why, that's why Dr. Robbins not looking over here because there's some dynamic going on between her and somebody else in the class, and it's going to end.
It's easy to excuse the oppressors if you think, okay, there's just something strange going on, but it's going to end. It's going to end. And eventually what happens is that people get co-opted into their roles. People eventually get co-opted into their roles. Anybody else on this side? Linda, what were you feeling? Because you were trying so hard to be heard.
Well, I figured out what was going on. That's why I had to just rebel and say, what did I say? An uprising without being called on. So.
But why didn't you do something?
I was looking back here at my mates, trying to get them to
And what happened?
And we were all just smiling at each other.
It also shows, the other thing that this shows is how very difficult it is, even when people have a class consciousness, and as you know, some of you did and some of you didn't. Some of you recognize it. Even when people recognize their circumstance, even if we took a break, I guarantee that it would have been very hard for you to get an uprising because how would you have reacted, any of you on this side, about an uprising?
It was feeling to me like cut off your nose to spite your face. I was interested in the class. I didn't want to miss out on the class. So it seemed childish and against my own interests. So I just wasn't really paying that much attention to organize an uprising or something.
Or even being part of one, because then you might even be more disfavored. And you won't be able to get the material. You won't be able to take what little part you can in this class system. How about you, Naftali? Then I'm going to ask Andrea. Oh, you don't have a microphone that works back there. Can you put... Okay.
At first I was just thinking, how rude she is, but then when I noticed that you were doing that repeatedly, then I recognized that it was on purpose.
And how does that make you feel?
I guess left out,
Would you have joined a class uprising?
I don't think so.
Why not? No, this is important. I really want you to think about this.
No, because I don't want to, get. I guess I don't want to be looked in a negative way from your side. So I guess I just want to be like, please.
You just wanted to blend in and put up with it. Okay, how about over here to Andrea? Can we move that? Thanks. I'm sorry. Now I left you really marginalized because you don't have a microphone. Sorry about that. I didn't know.
I just moved. I guess it's nothing that I haven't experienced before, so it was like whatever. Kind of.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I've just been in situations or like classes before where I wasn't getting called on, probably because I talk too much anyway. So it's like a time for other people to get to talk, so it's okay.
Okay, take a look. Thank you. What she just did was essentially to neutralize emotionally everything that was going on in here. Well, this has happened to me before. It's a rationalization. It's happened to me before. It doesn't mean that much. It does mean a lot, but we can say it doesn't mean that much. And what does she end up doing? Blaming herself for talking too much, and that's probably why she doesn't get called on. As opposed to there might be some other explanation about why you are being discriminated against. What we tend to do, in general, is first to internalize. What most conflict theorists would say is that people who are victims of discrimination tend initially not to see it. Initially. And it takes, as Marx said, developing a class consciousness, seeing that it's not just you. It's not just you, but it's all of you that are in this together before we can see that it's a structural element and not a personal failure. Personal failure. Who haven't we heard from? Michelle.
If we had an uprising, I might join in if there were enough numbers and I feel we had enough strength to win our uprising. But as for myself, I wasn't really contemplating one. I just, it wasn't bothering me that much that we weren't, being called on or anything. So I just sat in and just went with the flow of things.
Okay, so you're saying that you might consider it, but you'd have to really be bothered. Right. You'd have to really be bothered, and you'd have to develop. I mean, you all were aware, not all, many of you were aware that this was going on and that it was you as a class that was being ignored. But yet it takes a lot for people to get motivated to do something about it. What do you think any of you might have done had there been some kind of uprising? Yeah, Megan.
I was just going to say, I guess this is obvious, but I think it makes a difference to me knowing that it's an exercise that you're doing in class and because of the topic of the lecture. And the other thing I think that would make it different for me is that this is not really like a distinguishable group of people. If it would have been all one, gender or race, or if it weren't a class exercise and there was some discernible reason or like some classification you were making, then I think that I would be offended and I would probably join them. I mean, if it was like really a repetitive thing, and there was, maybe you didn't call on any of the men in the class, and they expressed being upset at that.
So what you're saying is that if there's a visible reason, something that we can visibly see for discrimination, we might be more likely, because we're social workers, right? We might be more likely to do something about that.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't have to be visible necessarily. I mean, maybe if these were all people from one section, and if there was some basis for it, I mean, I didn't know it was alphabetical, but it's obviously, kind of arbitrary in some manner because they're all different, so.
First, then second, yeah.
But I thought it was very visible that we were being oppressed. So my reason for the uprising, and I thought about getting a piece of paper and say, let's all walk out, was to make a point. I mean, not that I want to fail the class or anything like that, but just to kind of play with you and say, we're not going to take this.
And yet, what keeps us from doing it? What I want you to think about, what keeps you from doing that as individuals and as a group, and what keeps you from recognizing that and helping them? You had your hand up. Christina.
Well, before it even started, when you started separating everybody, I thought that you were trying to show the viewing audience like that we were diverse in the class.
Oh, I love it. I've never heard that one before. That's great.
So that's what I thought we were doing, because I was looking around and I'm like, wow, we are diverse in here. So.
And we are. We are a very diverse group. And that is the excuse that people make. Oh, she's having a bad day. I know this is not really her. Maybe she's got a headache. She's just doing this for a point to show that we're diverse, rather than seeing the reality of what's going on here. Who else had their hand up a minute ago? Yeah. Heather? And then Terica.
I was just going to say, I thought you kind of made it hard for an uprise, unless they just walked out. But every time they tried to talk or discuss, you shushed everybody and said, you know, don't talk in class, you're disrupting class. So I thought you made it hard for them to do an uprise together or plan something.
And structurally, isn't that what we do for people? Structurally, we make it hard. What do we do with our welfare system? We give the poorest of the poor just enough to keep them vested in the system. Think about that. Why do we not have uprisings? First of all, we have these aspirations to middle class status. We have this mythology that people can make it, and then, thanks to what we've done structurally to keep the poor from being in absolute utter poverty, they have a vested interest in that system. Whether they're getting food stamps, whether they're getting benefits for their children, they have a vested interest in the system, and if they rise up against it, they're going to lose the little they have. And you folks are going to lose everything. Yeah, Terica. Then there are two people I want to hear from.
I was actually disturbed because Linda is my group member. And then she kept raising her hand and you wasn't calling her. So if you had taken a break, I probably would have approached her and said, do you want to talk to her after class? Or maybe do you want to leave now and go speak with the dean? Because I think what she's for wrong. I think I would have done that because she's my group member and I felt like a closeness to her, even though, you know, I don't really know her. I just wanted her to be able to succeed in the class just as I was. So.
Okay, so sometimes it engenders feelings of anger against me, but you fail to see your own role in the fact that you sat there letting this continue. I mean, any of you, think about this, folks, any of you could have raised your hand and said, how come you're ignoring them? Did any of you think about doing it?
The thing is, we're being taped. I mean, that also...
But you know what?
We're being taped.
When I do this when it's not taped, we have the same results. Yeah, I want to hear from Tara.
Oh, basically, I felt bad for her back there, but I wasn't going to say anything because I didn't want to make you mad.
It's the same dynamic. That while we can empathize with the folks who are the have-nots, we are not willing to give up our position. We don't want to anger authority, and we really don't want to give up our position. Alicia.
Yeah, first of all, I came in a little late, so I wasn't exactly sure what the seating arrangement was. I knew it was obviously different. But then as Jean, especially I can identify with Jean when she said, Dr. Robbins, and you were like, shh, be quiet. I thought, oh, wow, something's going on terrible, but I really thought it was
Why
real.
Why did you do something about it? I really want us to think about, what I want us all to think about is our collective role in this. That it's not just me, that it's not just them, and it's not just you, that it's all of us that keep this structure going. Who had their hand up? Yeah.
I'm now thinking about it, some minutes later, I feel almost traumatized that I don't want to ask questions anymore.
Well, let's not
I'm
overuse the word traumatized.
Right, not traumatized, but I feel funny now. It's affected me as far as my wanting to speak out now. So.
Well, we'll be back to normal next week.
I know. It has affected me.
No, but what you're saying is that we do have strong emotional reactions. We have strong emotional reactions, and yet take a look at our inability to do something other than, as you did, feel terrible about it, but continue to keep the structure the way it is. First and second. Yeah. Alicia,
I wasn't quite...
Just a few minutes left.
Oh, okay. I was going to say I really wanted to blame them for their disruption. Just like, why can't you guys be quiet in class. Like, be quiet. If she wants you to be quiet, don't turn around. Don't, you know.
Absolutely. We blame them for the disruption rather than taking a look at the structural arrangements. And one more comment? Yeah, Leah.
Well, Marx would say we've been socialized that you're the professor and we don't need to stop the class. But if that had gone on all semester, we have like your comment cards and stuff, and we can always talk to the dean. So just because we didn't do something right then doesn't mean we wouldn't have done it had that gone on all semester.
And it probably would not have been effective taking action after the fact. Because what I'm trying to get you to see is that it's not just me that's oppressing them, it's you that's oppressing them, and you are buying into your own oppression. And so I hope you've learned something very experientially from class today. And I promise we will sit in whatever seat you want next week and you will not be ignored. Thank you. I'll see you all next week.